Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Civil War Review. The main purpose of this part of the unit is to give us some context for the next part of the unit, which is Reconstruction. If you recall, Civil War was taught last year in 8th grade, and Reconstruction is where we pick up. So the Civil War leading up to a time period known as Reconstruction. There will be three parts to the Civil War part of this unit. We end with the Civil War itself and anything within that pertains to Reconstruction. We'll also take a look at slavery and the status of slavery by the start of the Civil War. But we begin with the decade leading up to the Civil War and what happens in the 1850s. As we begin the section on the 1850s, you'll notice one theme running through this part of the unit, and that is the divide over slavery. So let's get a little introduction to this unit. The states in the North and the states in the South were pitted against each other due to their stances on slavery. The South for slavery and the North against slavery. This struggle led to political parties trying to maintain power in the government, popular opinion, and in the courts to continue or stop the spread of slavery as the United States expanded across the continent. So one of the things that is alluded to but not specifically mentioned is the United States is still growing during the 1850s, and there are a number of territories that are created this time or will be created in the future, and then those territories eventually become states. And territory states, part of the debate here is which states should or which states can have slavery, or which states can be slave states and which states must be free states. Here's the vocabulary for the unit. The Compromise of 1850 is keep in mind one of the key terms there, compromise. A part of the Compromise of 1850 is the Fugitive Slave Act, but that's important to note and have a vocabulary word on its own. Uncle Tom's Cabin is actually a novel, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act is a pretty big deal and lots of violence associated with that. The Dred Scott decision, that's a Supreme Court case in the United States, very impactful. The Republican Party is created during this time. Harpers Ferry, and then popular sovereignty is where we end. So let's get started with some of the events in the 1850s, and we start with the Compromise of 1850. Contextually speaking, or in the past, there was another compromise, and that compromise was called the Missouri Compromise. And the Missouri Compromise aimed to keep balance of free and slave states in the North and South. And as time progresses, this only becomes more important in many ways for the North and the South. And the United States, with the Compromise of 1850, continues this aim. It aims to keep not necessarily just the states in the North and South even, so there are the same number of free and slave states, but the tension between the North and South over slavery has been growing over this time. And the Compromise of 1850 it helps keep the Union together instead of really a civil war. Of course, we know the Civil War is on the horizon. If anything, this delays that. Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852, that is a novel. And what the novel really does, even though it's a fictional story, it depicts the evils and the happenings of slavery. The novel is absolutely appreciated and loved by abolitionists in the North. And at the same time, it is absolutely hated by Southerners, and Southerners represent these slave states. So you can see why they would dislike that. The Kansas-Nebraska Act, this leads to Bleeding Kansas. It's very much rooted in popular sovereignty. It involves a couple of rather infamous figures from history, John Brown and Charles Sumner. But there's a lot of, this is where we really see popular sovereignty being promoted, if you will, and that is the people should have a say as to whether or not a state should have slavery. And for example, the Kansas-Nebraska Act is actually threatening the Missouri Compromise. And because of people having the opportunity to decide who, if a state should have slavery, people flock to this region to put in their vote and try and make an impact that way, or having a say over this territory having slavery, or this state eventually having slavery. Before moving on to the rest of the 1850s timeline, let's take a look at this primary source document. If you're unaware of what a primary source document is, it is a document of some sort, such as a newspaper article or newspaper advertisement from the time period. So this is a primary source document, and it's related to what? To get to the what, let's take a look at some of these ideas. When was it? Can you make out where, when this document was? And assuming you took a look at it, you see April 24th, 1951, which, if we put into context, is not long after the Compromise of 1850. Where did this take place? Same thing here. You give a look around and you'll notice that it is specifically Boston located in Massachusetts, but we can also blow this up into a bigger idea. Boston is in a northern state and slavery is not allowed there. Finally, who does this involve? Well, we can say a couple of things about who it involves. The target of it is free Black persons and escaped slaves in Boston, but it also indirectly involves white individuals in the same area. If you're thinking that it has to do with the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, you are correct. Shortly after 1850, this comes out, Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. In 1851, this is published. Keep in mind, if you are white, you are now by law supposed to turn in any escaped slaves and get them back to the South. That's what this is about. That is the new law that was created as a part of the Missouri Compromise of 1850. Continuing on with the Civil War timeline, Republican Party, which we will hear a lot more about in the 1860s, is created in 1854. And later on in 1858, we're going to find out that Abraham Lincoln is a serious consideration for the Republican Party to run for president. The Republican Party is founded in 1854, and its existence, its purpose, it is rooted or grounded in being against slavery. In 1857, the Dred Scott case is heard by the U.S. Supreme Court, and Dred Scott is suing essentially for his freedom. that is struck down, and it has some big ramifications as far as where slavery is allowed in the United States. Hint, it is impeding upon the slave states. It is a big victory for slavery and a big victory for the South. 1858, and you get the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And it is this series of debates between Republican Abraham Lincoln and Democrat Stephen A. Douglas, and the idea of popular sovereignty, where the Republican Party really sees Abraham Lincoln as an individual who can run for president in 1860. But the other idea here is popular sovereignty, that people should get a say in whether or not a state should be free or it should be a slave state. Wrapping up the 1850s and heading into the year 1860, we get Harpers Ferry. This is a federal arsenal that is looted by John Brown. He had a goal to start a slave insurrection. It is, unfortunately for him, it is poorly constructed, and anybody that was freed was really uncertain that it was supposed to be an insurrection, and a big one at that, because he didn't notify any of the slaves that he was freeing in advance. So therefore, the slave insurrection at Harpers Ferry was put down immediately, and radical John Brown was killed as well. I put radical as a question mark here because what does make somebody like John Brown radical? Or is he even radical? Something for you to think about and look into. Election of Abraham Lincoln happens in 1860, and this is a big moment, not because simply Abraham Lincoln is elected, but because the South fears what his election means for slavery in the South. They fear that he wants to abolish slavery. That was not technically anything that he had said that he wanted to have happen. His goal was to keep the Union together. But the fears were there, and in 1860, late 1860, secession by southern states beginning with South Carolina. Here's the election of 1860 map. You'll notice very strongly in the North, you see a lot of Abraham Lincoln votes. He does get the needed number of electoral votes in order to become president. And then in the South, you see all these, so many of these southern states, they vote for the Democrat running Breckinridge. What's important to note here, in a state such as Florida or a state such as Louisiana, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, these states actually don't put Abraham Lincoln on the ballot. So it wasn't even an option to vote for Abraham Lincoln. Additionally, by 1860, if you look out west of the Mississippi, but really in that the flatlands area and the just shy of the West Coast, you see a lot of territories. These territories, such as the Kansas Territory by 1860 or the Nebraska Territory by 1860, or the area that I think you'll notice it's unorganized territory, but looks like the state of Oklahoma. These are lands that are territories, which is the first step in order to become a state. So they are not states yet, they are simply territories. A couple of conclusions before moving on to the next part of the unit. There are growing tensions between the North and the South. This is very evident in the 1850s. The 1850s start with compromise to kind of bring the country together, say we can move on as one. But by 1860 and the election of 1860, this is a big, big problem. And that is the tipping point, is the election of Abraham Lincoln. That's it for this video. We'll continue with the moving on to part 2 next time. Have a good one.